You are listening to Vote Her In, a collaboration between Two Broads Talking Politics and author Rebecca Sive. On today's episode, we speak with Aimee Allison, founder of She the People. Hi, everyone. This is Kelly, and you're listening to Vote Her In, which is a collaboration between Two Broads Talking Politics and author Rebecca Sive. We're coming to you now as the country is starting to reopen and reclose. So I'm still in quarantine. I don't know about the rest of you. And I will turn it over now to Rebecca, who will introduce our guest.
Yeah, I think a lot of us are in quarantine, but delighted to be able to keep working and keep organizing and advocating. And so today we're all of the above because we have a fabulous guest in the person of Aimee Allison, as you all probably know, founder of She the People. And she's done some amazing work over the last few years among women of color throughout the country. And as the presidential heats up, and we get close to a woman nominee as the vice presidential candidate on the Democratic side, we thought it would be great to hear from Aimee about, her thoughts on that topic and related issues of women in politics and this incredibly important time we're in between now and November 3rd. So I'm going to say welcome, Aimee, and ask her to begin by sharing with us exactly, her thoughts about what she sees right now at this, I think, historic moment for any number of reasons, but certainly for the cause and the campaign that Aimee's involved in. So welcome, Aimee.
Thank you so much, both of you, for having me. I'm just really happy to be here. What do I see? It's like
where to start, right?
We are in unprecedented times, aren't we? We're in a place we haven't been before, both in the negative sense and also in the potential sense. There's a lot going on.
Right. And when you think about that in your own work, what was it that precipitated your doing this organizing work initially, and the directions you're taking right now?
The election in 2016, I remember being in a small fundraiser near my home in Oakland, California. And I was one of just maybe about 30 people, mostly wealthy individuals, who were there in August before the election with Hillary Clinton. It was to be a fundraiser for her presidential campaign. And many of the people that were sitting around this dinner were asking questions about issues that they cared about. But when it was my turn to ask a question, I said, Secretary Clinton, because Black women are your most critical voter. And then I stopped right there. There was this kind of almost like a groan or a tisk from the audience that people did not understand fundamentally that Black women were the most loyal Democrats. We had the highest turnout of any race and gender, and Democrats simply could not win without us. And more than that, when I went on to ask Secretary Clinton, look, I appreciate your campaign acknowledging that equal pay day for Black women is much later than white women, because equal pay day in my world had always been celebrated based on where white women were, and we're all to be, kind of in any of the acknowledgments of gender disparity, that it was based on white women's experience. And so I want to just thank your campaign, for acknowledging that for Black women, it's a different day. But how are you embracing and speaking to Black women in your campaign? And I remember Hillary Clinton responding, first reading the room and saying, look, she's right. Black women are an essential core group of voters. But in 2016, as we found out, without an investment in Black and other women of color voters, by focusing and relying on a Democratic win on white women, well, we all know how that turned out. And I'm convinced that if there had been a broader and deeper understanding of who lives in this country, whose vote drives progressive transformation, and the lack of long-term investment in the very voters who could propel progressives to win. I think without that, we can't move forward as a country. And in fact, what Trump represents to the danger, everyday danger to all of us, but and we see it most, in the pandemic and in unemployment and all of the things, that this is a danger that women of color, Black and brown women, already saw in 2016. And if the country saw us and followed our lead, we get out of the mess. So that's what inspired me starting She the People, because I knew that the country needed a new story about women of color, needed a new story about American politics, and the Democrats needed a new playbook to win. And it's a way that would serve us more deeply, have different leaders with different results.
And can you tell us why you started the way you did? I remember early on in the formation of the group hearing about this amazing assembly you had, a presidential forum. Can you tell us what your sort of strategy was by going big right from the start?
Well, it's almost like go big or go home.
Right.
Actually, we didn't start in Houston, Texas a year ago at the presidential forum. We actually started in San Francisco with the first national Women of Color political conference. And that's where we launched She the People. It was only a few weeks before the midterm elections, in which we had some historic women of color that were running, Deb Haaland and Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and AOC and Lauren, so many that were running, had gotten through very difficult primaries. And we launched it to say, women of color will deliver the primary victory for Democrats. Women of color are the most successful organizers of an inclusive multiracial coalition, particularly in the South and Southwest, where they're battleground states. Women of color are holding the clearest vision for and kind of a moral center for the country in terms of shaping our politics and our government. And we are coming together across race, not as a racial identity, but as a multiracial political bloc that works in solidarity. And we started very early on working with reporters about the numbers, how we're the fastest growing voting bloc. We're going to deliver, making these promises. And our turnout increased 37% over 2014. And women of color were responsible for the Democrats getting the majority in the House, for Nancy Pelosi to get her job, all that. We had women from 37 states come to San Francisco. I said, look, what's the biggest thing we can do to put us on the political map? The biggest thing we could do is host a presidential forum for women of color. And that's exactly what we did. I said, look, let's do it early. We have such a big, diverse set of candidates. Let's do it in a swing state. We knew Texas was a swing state before it was declared a swing state 3 days ago by national media. We knew that Texas was a majority people of color state. We knew that was within 3 points of flipping, that it was women of color-led organizers like Michelle Tremillo, who runs the Texas Organizing Project, and JOLT, founded by Christina Sitsun Ramirez. We knew that they were doing the hard year-long work of registering and talking to voters of color. We knew that. So we held the presidential forum at the Texas Southern, which is Barbara Jordan, the first Black woman who was Congresswoman out of Texas, at Houston, Texas, in the most diverse county in the country. And we pulled together 2,000 women of color from over 25 states. And we had 8 presidential candidates, 300 media, and millions of people who heard us ask the question, look, why should women of color support you? That literally was a question that had never been asked to a presidential hopeful. And it was profound, the cultural shift that happened in its wake. So we just figured, if we're going to tell a story, we're going to do it powerfully. It can't just be confined to the political opinion pages or some kind of research or polling. It's got to be a story about who we are as Americans. And to make a group of people visible that hadn't been visible before and powerful in ways that we're still feeling, that's amazing. And that's why we started this, because now universes can come from the possibility of us being seen and heard more powerfully right now.
So Joe Biden is going to announce who his vice presidential pick is within the next few weeks. And we know he said it will be a woman. It looks like it's very possible it could be a woman of color. If you were going to advise the vice presidential nominee, what would you want to see her focusing on in the next few months? The election is not that far away at this point. Who are the people she should be talking to? What are the kinds of issues she should be talking about? What would your advice be?
She the People polled our members back in February before the quarantine. We said, what women of color should be VP? That we recognized, and we wanted a full acknowledgement that the term women in politics doesn't actually mean anything, because race is more of a determinant of people in the voting booth than gender. And so the insistence that we have a woman of color came very early on this year. And our folks wanted, Stacey Abrams from the swing state Georgia, who ran for governor, Kamala Harris from the nation's largest populated state, California, a senator. Tammy Duckworth was on that. There are others on our list that have now bubbled up in terms of, including Congresswoman Karen Bass, who many people believed would replace Pelosi. And we have this embarrassment of riches in terms of the talent that we have. But when we look at practically why we need, and I believe we need a woman of color VP, is because we have an opportunity to connect the movements that are happening in the street demanding racial justice with the practical policy making. But we already know that we have the people in this country that are diverse, in a voting coalition that could come together. We elected Barack Obama. He was the only Democrat that's been elected in the last 20 years. And the reason is because Barack Obama's candidacy appealed to people across race, and people showed up as part of a multiracial coalition. The VP needs to help Joe Biden embrace and be a champion for racial and economic justice, for gender justice, to translate the ticket into practically connecting with the very people that we need to turn out despite the pandemic and voter suppression, all the challenges, people making governors and others making vote by mail seem like it's a crime or making it more difficult. We have to have people who are so motivated. But right now, Joe Biden has an enthusiasm gap. We just finished a series of listening sessions and heard from women, particularly in battleground states like Arizona and Florida and Michigan, that there isn't a lot of enthusiasm amongst our communities for the presidency right now. You got to think about a year ago, if racial justice was, if we'd had the protests a year ago, maybe Julian Castro or Cory Booker would be the candidate, but that's not how things shook out. So a VP candidate needs to first and foremost be a champion for racial justice and to directly address the economic pain that people are entering into. $1,200 for 4 months of being out of work, and essential workers who got hazard pay but are going back to their sub $15 an hour jobs. Those are real issues. People facing the fact they can't pay rent. I feel like there's an opportunity for a VP candidate to both speak the language in the broadest sense of that phrase, speak the language of multiracial communities, and to communicate how in touch this ticket is with addressing real solutions. So that's where I see we could close the enthusiasm gap. A woman of color that we could work with could help us cement the multiracial coalition that we need to win in November.
One of the things related to this discussion, of course, is the fact that, this is an executive role. And Kelly and I were prompted to start doing this Voter In podcast because of my book, Voter In, which discusses, as you may know, the importance of women attaining more executive, political, and governmental positions. And so we're kind of at this point now where we can both work toward that with a vice presidential candidate and hopefully a winning ticket. But also we've seen in this past few months, the work of a number of women in executive roles, that is, as mayors of major cities. And I'm wondering if you could sort of comment from that perspective about what you think we have learned from them generally, and what those who may run coming up behind them, like this vice presidential candidate, could take away from what they've done and how they've done it.
It's such a good point about particularly Black women in executive roles, both as mayors, as governors. We are so severely underrepresented up and down ballot, but particularly in executive roles. But we've seen now Black women heads of mid or large-sized cities. There were 0 in 2010. There are 9 now, including the mayor of San Francisco. But I also learned a lot from being a big supporter of Stacey Abrams' gubernatorial bid in 2018. People couldn't imagine a Black woman as an executive of any state, because there never had been one for 400 years of our history. So I literally couldn't picture that. But how important is it that Black women and Latinas, Asian American women, Indigenous women are in executive roles that hold so much power over practices, policies, budgets, staffing, because it's never just that person. It's the whole team that the executive brings in to implement, governmental practice policies and departmental priorities. So the executive role, I think, is the frontier. That's the area where women of color need both focus and support. And also, we need to be thinking about the characteristics of the leaders who have not had an opportunity. Like I said, women of color are the most likely to be challenged in primaries, to be defeated in primaries by other, usually Democrats, before going on to general elections. So this is an issue both in that we can address by expanding the imagination of who is a leader and what those leaders look and sound like, what their background and profile is, and then doing practical support for high potential leaders who want to lead, who are executives, giving them support very early so that they can rise up to be the mayors, the governors, and others. The legislative role is amazing for some, and the executive role is amazing for others. And I think we need to see women of color in both. And, it's the VP slot is different now than it's been considered in the past. Before it was like, okay, we're going to choose a VP based on a calculation of what voters we need in a coalition. We're going to use a calculation based on what state that particular VP candidate will bring along. But when you think about Hillary Clinton's decision to tap Tim McCain in 2016, it solidified in the hubris and the mistake of an all-white slate for a party that's in a country that's nearing half or more than half people of color. It's a mismatch. So this is an opportunity now to rethink about the VP role as expanding the coalition, bringing in communities that would otherwise feel like they didn't see themselves in the campaign, and be a co-governance champion of issues as opposed to just a plus one. That's not how it's going to operate now.
I think the other change has been that, in part because of Joe Biden's age, people are thinking about who he selects completely differently. This person has to be able to perhaps step in, right? And he'll be the oldest candidate, I think, by quite some years.
I think you're completely right. And the fact that so many women of color, particularly Black women, are being vetted right now. And I had an event with Lisa Rochester Blunt, who's the congresswoman from Delaware, who's sitting on the committee to make recommendations to Joe Biden for the VP pick. So many Black women are being considered. And we literally have never been here before. We've never been here. Black women have served, particularly in Democratic, also Republican administrations, as we know from Condi Rice, Secretary of State. Black women have had key roles, but we've never been considered in this way for an executive role. And, it's not just historic. It's not just symbolic. It's what the country needs. We need a woman of color, particularly a Black woman, in a powerful executive role to lead this country out of its mess. And so much, it puts a lot of pressure on the person who's selected, but that's the kind of cleanup that the administration will need to do, even to get us back to what I consider kind of an unacceptable. It wasn't, the country wasn't working great for women of color before 2016. So there's work to move us forward. And I think it's going to take really strong executive leadership to make that happen.
This has been a really big year in Supreme Court decisions. I guess every June now we are all anxiously holding our breath for Supreme Court decisions. But there have been a few in recent weeks that have been really important for women on the issue of birth control access under the Affordable Care Act and women's access to abortion. Do you see some of these decisions as mobilizing forces for the elections in November? Do you think that these are issues that are going to drive women and women of color in particular to come out to the polls? What are you seeing?
You can think of women of color as a voting bloc, as the most likely group of voters to support a whole host of justice issues, reproductive justice being extremely important. But unlike groups who have been around for a long, long time, who were framing the issue as abortion rights, I think women of color perceive and, kind of think about reproductive justice more broadly as an economic issue, as a racial justice issue. There's a lot tied up in that. I think that, there was an Asian American Political Institute did a study, and I wrote partially about that, and I wrote about some broader trends of women of color for a publication that's out by the Democracy Alliance. And one of the things that we learned is that women of color are the most likely to support both on the ballot measures and politicians who make reproductive justice a cornerstone of their political intentions, their political will, and their policy platforms. So I think reproductive justice in the context of the economy, in the context of race, in the context of gender, those things continue to be driving forces for women of color voters. When we polled our national network about the issues, we actually have a poll out right now that people can take if they go to shethepeople.org. That we're asking people to give their top issues. We will periodically measure what is motivating people to go to the polls. What's bubbled up for us is racial justice, and people want solutions for that. But that's not to the exclusion of something like reproductive justice. That's understanding reproductive justice in the context of racial justice. So it's all intersectional and connected. Those are women of color don't want to be considered a GOTV universe, like a get out the vote universe. Democrats, actually, this is bigger than party. The old playbook really goes to women of color, people of color, 4 to 6 weeks before an election, and assumes that we won't have high turnout and doesn't engage voters in long-term persuasion on key issues like reproductive justice. That's a big mistake. Women of color, because we're such a key part of the electorate, our turnout numbers will determine and shape the political futures of our country, but also individual campaigns, that they need to come and talk and listen to what women of color want and what are the top priority issues for them.
And related to that, of course, are the key Senate races of this year and the focus on trying to win back the Senate and reverse the McConnell-Trump era. I'm wondering if you could share with us your thoughts on those races and any involvement that the people may have in those particular states that you see as a priority.
I think if the Biden ticket is successful in November, it'll be hard to push through a legislative agenda without the Senate. McConnell's still in control, and he has been so very damaging. Right. So you're right. I think looking at the Senate is important. when we planned out our political program at the beginning of 2020, even not knowing about the impact that COVID was going to have on our country and our individual lives, we said, look, there are 7 states that are priority states for us, and we're going to do an historic women of color kind of coordinated campaign that focuses on Arizona, Texas, Georgia, Florida, as well as Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. But the first 4 states all have key Senate races. And what we have been continuing to do, because there are Senate races in all of those states that require expanding the electorate, powering up and long-term investment in the registration and high turnout of women of color as the core, because in those states, majority of people in Arizona, in Texas, in Florida, and Georgia are people of color, and women of color, the majority of women. So where we have been working very closely with One Arizona, which is a Latino-run statewide voter engagement, kind of expanding the electorate, and they work year round, not just for the election cycle. Michelle Tremillo at Texas Organizing Project, Andrea Mercado at Florida New Majority, Inse Ufat at New Georgia Project. These women of color run really big and very successful statewide efforts. So She the People is focusing on coordinating, leaning deeply into enhancing those efforts through our work on digital, identifying women of color that are eligible to vote and who haven't. Because when we pulled the numbers, we look, in those states that have Senate races, if we look at 2016 versus 2012, because women of color typically have a higher vote turnout, but we were just turned out on the average numbers in 2016. It's one of the reasons why Democrats would lose the statewide races. So the same operating principle around a presidential campaign winning a state and a Senate campaign winning a state is the same, which is we only win as Democrats by expanding the power of the most loyal, most progressive voters, women of color. And that requires us to have a sustained investment and deep prioritization of those. And this is an environment. Listen, I'm talking to you. I know you all know this, but there is so many decades and decades of this. We should say centuries of a political system that's focused on white dudes, and more broadly, white people as voters and what their concerns are, et cetera, in a country where the Democrats have lost the white vote for a long, long time. And they only topped out at 44% when Bill Clinton ran. Right. So they're going to lose the white vote. And so when we just look at strategically, how are those Senate seats? How's Mark Kelly going to win in Arizona statewide? It's going to be powered by Black and brown voters, mostly Latinx voters in that state, who are the majority of people there and strong Democrats. How are the 2 candidates, Reverend Warnock, going to win in Georgia? He's going to win by following Stacey Abrams' playbook and powering and magnifying the powerful vote of Black women who are near 40% of the electorate there. How is that, and same in Florida. So this is where I'm saying is if we focus on the path to victory is not by buying a bunch of TV ads, actually, because that's millions of dollars that go into Senate campaigns, usually TV ads, but instead saying, who are the on-the-ground organizers that we can invest in that will bring their folks along? Who are the trusted voices that can actually activate people and do it in the midst of a pandemic?
Both from your own experience and from what you've seen of these on-the-ground organizers, these women who are leading incredible organizations, what is some advice that you have for anyone who's listening, who's thinking about following in these kinds of footsteps, who wants to be involved in public advocacy and politics? What would your advice be for them and in ways to sort of be thinking through that future?
It's funny because I'm 50, and for most of my career, I was, not the person out front. And She the People was a creation based on the fact that it's a very common experience amongst women of color to have a story to tell, have ideas, but not really know how to do it. And someone like me, who's been in social justice or politics for a really long time, sometimes it can feel like you can be involved in that and not make enough to get to pay your rent, and it could feel very, difficult. And it's harder for women of color because I'll speak as a Black woman. We'll be like, okay, well, you can volunteer your time, and do a lot. And a lot of Black and brown women do that on top of their regular job. But how can you make a career and a legacy based on something you create yourself? And for me, the change came when I went on a trip with a group of 20 women in this group called How Women Lead. We went to Havana, Cuba for a week. So it was like, we were visiting this country a lot of Americans didn't have access to. We met entrepreneurs. There was a lot of women on the trip who were in their 60s and 70s, further down the road, and had many of them started businesses or had been in the C-suite, been very successful. And when I was telling them before I even started She the People, look, I know women of color are the key. I see something that other people don't see. I feel confident that if we focused on women of color and we followed women of color, that we could transform this country. And I was so passionate about it. The women on the trip, and then afterwards said, look, we believe, we want that. We want the vision of America that you're painting for us. And what's more, there's no barriers. We're behind you. And what's more, we're going to support you. And that was the group of women who helped give me the confidence to see, hey, this is possible, and the courage to go beyond the job that I was doing, and to find the resources. And now She the People's only 2 years old. We've been in every major publication. We've contributed to a transformation in culture where women of color are now recognized as a political bloc. We are in a position to be a leading voice calling for a woman of color VP, and to say we're not just a vote, we want to govern because our vision is what America needs. We're in that position. It would not have been possible if I didn't have women around me who believed in me and said, we're going to do everything we can, our time, our money, to actually help you launch this thing. And so now we have, I have interns and younger women. And I spoke at a college class, I think about a month ago. And the women are like, I want to do it, but I don't know how. It's not like jobs to do what you do are like posted. And so my thing is, listen, if you are still enough to find out who you want to show up as and why. I always say, this is something they would say in church growing up. Whose water do you carry? If you're called into service, to what end? And if you're clear about that, then, and you listen to yourself as your guide and surround yourself with women who see the very best in you and who believe in you, that is the ingredients to be able to create a really fulfilling, impactful career. And in my case, this is legacy work that I'm doing. I can do this work for the next 20 years, and we would only just get started. So I want She the People to be a place that younger women can go to connect with the network, to get encouragement, to get training, to actually practice doing all the things. And then I want them to do their thing,
right. Exactly.
and to encourage young women in that. There's a future for you. You can bring, you are enough. Your talents, your vision, you're enough. And we need you our country needs you. We need you and your leadership. And so the challenge is to listen to yourself enough to figure out what your particular role will be.
I can't think of a better note to end on. I hope everyone is just taking this to heart. I've been scribbling here, remembering you are enough, right? and that we don't just want to vote, we want to govern. Thank you so much, Aimee, for joining us. We hope you'll come back and keep us posted. And in the meanwhile, stay safe. And of course, I know you'll stay busy.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
The Vote Her In segment is a collaboration of Two Broads Talking Politics and author Rebecca Sive. Our theme song is called Are You Listening, off of the album Elephant-Shaped Trees by the band Aimee, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast. You can contact us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com or on Twitter or Facebook at Two Broads Talk. You can find all of our episodes at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com or anywhere podcasts are found.